Hello! Welcome to my office. So I think last time we did this, we all came to my study at home. Today we're in my office. So let's see, you've got intake, outtake back there, plenty of pictures and maps to go around, completely surrounded by them. So today's topic is going to be ancient agriculture in North America. But I also want to cover some other forms of Native American cultivation as well. There seems to be a lot of confusions about the origins of agriculture in the Americas, as well as some ongoing controversies about what counts as agriculture, what counts as horticulture, what counts as cultivation at all, and who gets to do it or have done it. So, yeah, I'm just noticing my collar's a little crooked. The way we're going to do this is I have a pre-recorded segment that's roughly about a half hour long. And then after playing through that pre-recorded segment, we'll jump back live on the air here, and I'll take your questions on social media. So, since this is streaming on YouTube, please post your questions to YouTube. It's going to be much easier for me to monitor that than doing it from other platforms. And yeah, I apologize in advance if there's any glitches, errors, if the microphone's clipping. We're still getting this setup worked out. Like many folks out there, this is a learning process for us as well. But yeah, and before we jump into the video, check out. Yeah, we're doing some upgrades on the equipment here, so. Alright, without any further ado, we're going to jump into that recorded session. So it's a good rule of thumb. If you're filming an archaeology video, and you get the chance to start it by showing some ruins, start it by showing those ruins. What I've got before me is an old buried culvert, almost completely overgrown by a cottonwood tree. Today we'll be talking about Native American agriculture, both in the past and in the present. So what does an old overgrown culvert have to do with Native American agriculture? Stick with me, and we'll find out. So this beautiful stream here before me was not naturally formed. This is an irrigation ditch, or as we call it here, an acequia. Now, if you grew up in New Mexico, you were probably taught that the acequias were introduced by the Spanish in the early 17th century. If you got the extra credit, then you probably know that the Spanish learned it from the Moors during the Moorish occupation of the Iberian Peninsula that lasted nearly 800 years. But the acequias weren't the first irrigation ditches here, and in fact, irrigating crops by ditches goes back at least 1,000 years, and probably much more. Indigenous agriculture across the Americas used a number of technologies. We're going to be focusing on some of the crops, some of the domesticates, and some of the water delivery systems, and how the acequias didn't necessarily replace the existing irrigation ditches, but more improved upon a system that was deeply ingrained into Pueblo society. So the acequia system was very much a shared system between the native Pueblo Indians and the Spanish colonial settlers. This system shares its origins in the common meeting, actually right here at the foot of Mesa Verde, at the Pueblo of Oaxaca, also known as San Juan Pueblo. When Juan de Oñate arrived at Oaxaca in 1598, there was a minor drought going on that year. As Francis Quintana puts it, the Rio Grande was running so low that the ditch intakes had failed, and the harvest was imperiled. The Franciscan friars with Oñate promptly intoned a prayer, and within 24 hours a heavy rain fell. gratified, the Indians allowed the Spaniards to settle Yunque Owenge, now San Gabriel, facing San Juan on the west bank of the Rio Grande. Indians and Spaniards then prepared for the following spring's planting by building new ditch intakes and laterals. Thus began a network of irrigation systems which, by the late 18th century, was shared by Pueblo Indians and Spanish settlers throughout the Tewa Basin. The colonists introduced some advanced irrigation techniques, such as dams built above the ditch intakes, movable wooden ditch gates, and flumes. So, how accurate is this story? Well, archaeological evidence would suggest that the ditch system does predate this story, and of course, as Quintana notes, that was actually the case. But what about the controls? What about the gates? So, here are some examples from around Zuni Pueblo in a paper by Damp, Hall, and Smith. Their excavations revealed a little bit of a surprise. Prior to their work, we generally believed that irrigation systems in the Pueblo regions date to roughly 1000 CE or AD, same dates, but Damp, Hall, and Smith push back these dates from their findings. Archaeological evidence shows, as in the diagram here, that there were a series of ditches running off of the river channel or diverted from the river channel, and that these were in fact controlled, not just open. A stone slab with a control gate, or as a control gate, standing in the ditch, still upright and perpendicular to the buried ditch underground when they found it, indicates that while the use of wood for gates might have been introduced by the Franciscans after contact with Oñate, that similar functioning stones were actually used in this place up until that point. So how revolutionary was the ditch gate? Well, we shouldn't take credit from away from the Native Americans who were controlling the water prior to this. Also interestingly is that the dates from Zuni push back ditch agriculture much earlier than we would have believed. But one of the things that I want to focus on before going back to this earliest irrigation is what was being irrigated. We generally believe that irrigation ditches arrived in the Southwest along with maize. The date for the arrival of maize, too, has been pushed back to now roughly 1,000 years BCE, before current era. Also, if you want to put that date another way, 3,000 years ago. By 1000 CE, maize was grown alongside beans, squash, melons, and chilies. And in fact, these seem to have also been cultivated in the Southwest very early on as well. Zuni, however, is not a perfect way of extrapolating what else has gone on in the Pueblo Southwest. So this data from Zuni we use as a sort of, in archaeology we call it ethnographic analogy. We take anthropological, ethnographic work from an area, we correlate that with the histories as indicated by the archaeology, and then we apply that to interpret similar patterns in the archaeological record in similar places. However, Zuni is a language isolate, meaning they don't speak, not only do they not speak the same language as other Pueblos, but they speak a language from a completely different language family from the other Pueblos. And so we have to be careful when applying ethnographic analogy, because we might in fact be seeing things from two largely genetically unrelated groups that happen to occupy the same area. And yet, we should take some lessons from Zuni before we dive further into the pueblos, because we see other pueblo irrigation techniques also at the pueblo of Zuni. And interestingly, there was a switch around the year 1050 from ditch irrigation to flood irrigation. This seems to be because the river channels downcutted so much that it cut off these canals. Similar to kind of how you hear this story when the Rio Grande ran low at San Juan Pueblo. But in Zuni, because of this downcutting and cutting off the ditches, instead of continuing to dig deeper ditches and fight what might have been a losing battle, they switched to flood irrigation, using check dams to divert stormwater. And this is something that we see at other pueblos, in fact, even on the slopes of Mesa Prieta itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because we want to go to the Chaco world. Chaco is often seen as a forebearer of Pueblo society, and many Pueblos trace their ancestry, their roots, to Chaco Canyon. Included in the Chaco system are also Chaco outliers, so as you're seeing here. But the show stealer for Chaco are the great houses with their massive kivas. And so, as we look at Chaco, we often believed Chaco to be one of the earliest places where agriculture emerged in the Southwest. However, data from places like Zuni seems to overturn this somewhat. And yet, Chaco was something monumental. Chaco is something ancestral to all the Pueblos, or at least in the memory of the Pueblos. It is considered an ancestral place. And so, if we want to look for farming practices that are comparable to the Pueblos that we see today, we look back at Chaco. Now, right down the middle of Chaco, there is a massive wash. We call this Chaco Wash. It's an ephemeral stream or ephemeral river, meaning that it tends to only run seasonally, and particularly when there is precipitation or shortly thereafter. Chaco Wash has significantly downcut in the last 800 or so years since the site was last significantly occupied. And yet, we still believe that some of this water was diverted to irrigate crops in Chaco. But it was still unreliable, and in fact, it doesn't seem to have been the main farming technique there. Most of Chaco Canyon is marginal land, so while there are tens of thousands of acres, only a few hundred are considered truly productive. To maximize the use of this land, farmers would diversify their strategies so that they could reduce risk and farm in a variety of spots. This includes what might be called action farming, which is using gates or open dams to divert alluvial flow onto the alluvial floodplain. We also see the use of the edges and mouths of drainages, as well as a very diagnostically Pueblo way of farming called the gridded garden. Now, this mixture of strategies, based on some estimates that these strategies could produce enough corn for one person per 1.5 acres, or 1.5 acres per person, would suggest that Chaco Canyon itself could feed about 250 people, roughly. Now, the capacity of all the great houses is much more than this. In fact, 10 to 20 times more than this. So we have to wonder, where is all the food coming from? Now, generally we believe that Chaco was not occupied to maximum capacity consistently throughout the year, but rather at specific significant times. However, at these specific significant times, there would be far more people than Chaco could support. So where's this corn coming from? Analysis has shown that some of the maize corn grown in Chaco was consumed there. Mostly we find this to be the case at Pueblo Bonito, one of the larger great houses. However, other great houses show cobs are sourced from Chaco outlier sites, such as Aztec ruins and Solomon ruins, both in the greater Farmington area. These places are architecturally tied to Chaco, and so it's now outlandish to think that these have similarities, that they're participating in the same cultural system. In fact, that is the general consensus right now. This land is also more productive, being at the confluence of rivers. So some estimates about that productivity at Chaco compare it to places like Mesoamerica. Specifically, the Oaxaca Valley in Mesoamerica. However, this may not be quite so accurate for Chaco as much as the Farmington area. And indeed, the productivity of the Farmington area might more accurately match the productivity of the Oaxaca Valley than would Chaco, especially given these estimates that Chaco could really only support about 250 people. However, the Oaxaca Valley supported large state-level societies. But it is worth going down this Mesoamerica rabbit hole, because this is where maize was domesticated. A little bit further south of Oaxaca is the state of Chiapas, and on the Pacific coast of Chiapas, there is a region called the Soconusco. So this is along the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, where the continent is the narrowest and is generally regarded as the boundary between North America and Central America. The Soconusco is along this isthmus on the Pacific coast, and that is where maize was first domesticated as much as 5,000 years ago. We believe that, again, that channel irrigation arrived in the Southwest with maize, but this happened in more than one wave. It didn't just arrive and everyone started farming it, but rather a variety of strains of maize, a variety of varieties, if you will, arrived at different times with specifically high elevation strains that would be suitable both to Oaxaca Valley and to much of New Mexico, really arriving much later. So then we get to the Post-Chaco world. And we can come back a little bit more to things that are somewhat recognizable. After Chaco, we again see water channels, but then we get cliff dwellings, like you see in the pictures of Mesa Verde here. It is generally believed that the occupants of Mesa Verde farmed the uplands, the tops of the mesas. However, this may not have always been reliable, as we believe that the residences below the cliff dwellings are a sign that the area was subject to violence and conflict between groups. And so, again, a diversity of strategies would be necessary. So we also see more stormwater gathering, catch dams, and water spreading, as well as the very difficult seep springs. So in the backs of some of these shelters, there are springs. And while this may not necessarily be enough water to irrigate large farm crops, it would be sufficient for residential use and possibly for garden use too. And so that brings us back around to the Acequias. Welcome to my garden. I'm sitting over an offshoot of the main ditch. Often we just call this a ditch, but the appropriate word is laterals. And may I introduce you to my cat, Paco. Now, the Spanish word for laterals, laterales, according to some sources, would appropriately be sangrias. But rather than this being something you can get tipsy off of at a social function, just water, mountain runoff, diverted from usually the nearest river into the main ditch, or Acequia Madre. From the Acequia Madre, the water is released through gates in a controlled fashion to water individual plots. In this age, private properties. This is a coordinated effort that is often seen to build and reinforce community structures. Because we don't just take water willy-nilly. We schedule the water that we take through the manager of the ditch, the water master, the mayordomo. Mayordomo's job is to coordinate to ensure that folks who are upstream, like me, don't empty the ditch when people who are downstream are watering. In this manner, the acequia system is more than just a simple ditch. It's more than just a network of ditches, but instead it's a community structure and a social structure, one that reinforces a sense of community through a sense of cooperation and at times can raise contention. So we've covered the Pueblos from thousands of years ago, and as well as Mesoamerica several thousand years ago, up through today. We've covered that the Acequia system represents a merging of cultures between the Pueblos, the Spaniards, and the Moorish influence on the Spaniards. We might also add that the Moors took inspiration from the Indus Valley, but that's getting a little off topic. Here I'd like to show Cahokia. Woodhenge was a calendar, and calendars are one of the technologies agriculturalists use in order to schedule planting, harvesting, feasting, and other events closely tied to agricultural production. Cahokia was a part of the Mississippian culture, spanning along, of course, much of the Mississippi drainage and into the American Southeast. I would also like to cover another mound builder culture, Hopewell, found in what is now Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Now, Hopewell built mounds differently from the ones that you're seeing on the screen. Whereas the Mississippians built these large platforms that had buildings on top of them, Hopewell built geometric and effigy mounds. And when I say effigy mounds, I'm talking about, say, Serpent Mound in Chillicothe, Ohio. So the Hopewell and the Mississippians did build mounds, yes, and these mounds helped orchestrate agricultural production. In fact, a significant amount of work has been done on astronomical alignments of Hopewell architecture with particular calendric markers, including equinoxes, solstices, and the cross corners, which, for those of you who are not familiar with cross corners, are the dates midway in between an equinox and a solstice. The cross corners are particularly useful for planning agricultural events, especially planting and harvesting seasons. You may be familiar with Halloween. Who isn't? Halloween is a cross corner. It's sometimes known by the word Samhain, to use a pre-Christian word. And Samhain was as much a celebration of the harvest as it was with the mysticism of this opening of a gateway to the underworld, or an opening of the door between the worlds that we associate with Halloween today. Similar things are seen in archaeoastronomical investigations in North America, a topic that we'll cover in another talk. So yes, we see that the Hopewell were timing their agriculture by using architecture that they built, or by planning their architecture to line up with the positions of the sun on the significant dates necessary for maximizing crop harvests. But we don't know much about what the Hopewell actually grew, because simply the investigations into that are generally lacking. So seems to be true up to the date of my sources, at least. But in the Mississippian area, maize was a huge boom. However, there was a distinct domestication and farming event that preceded maize agriculture in the Mississippian drainage bottom. This earlier domestication event included a number of seeds, such as sunflowers and cereals. A lot of these seeds required a lot of effort and energy to harvest and process compared to the energy yields, which might explain why maize was so readily adopted. However, there has been a significant amount of confusion with folks trying to tie the Mississippian culture with Mesoamerica, because we see these large platform mounds reminiscent of earthen pyramids, and we have maize. However, this is definitely a culturally distinct area, not an outpost of Mesoamerica. So if I just want to clear up a little bit of pseudo-archaeology right there, if that is one thing that I can accomplish in this, what you're seeing here, taken outside of St. Louis, is not an outpost of a Mesoamerican culture. It is an indigenous North American culture who may have had down-the-line trade connections, much in the way that the Southwest has down-the-line connections to Central America as well. So returning to the Mississippian culture, and this monumental site of Cahokia outside of St. Louis, there was a wet period between the years 1050 and 1200. This wet period created bumper crops for the better part of a century and a half, allowing this monumental city to expand and to expand its political influence over the landscape. However, much like Chaco, and in fact, in roughly the same time period, Cahokia too collapsed. Now there are more controversial farming areas as well, or rather areas of cultivation. So what you're seeing here are photos from the Mojave Desert. It's believed by many archaeologists that no native agriculture occurred in California prior to Euro-American contact. This is the position of prominent archaeologists such as Robert Bettinger. However, there certainly was maize agriculture in California on the margins of the Mojave and Sonoran deserts by the Patayan culture, also sometimes called Hakataya. The Patayan were neighbors of the Hohokam, who were known to grow maize using the channel irrigation. And in fact, we see that along the Colorado River as it borders California and Arizona. More contentious is the cultivation of plants by non-sedentary societies. So while Patayan and Hohokam may have been largely sedentary, able to farm a plot, we also had semi-mobile hunter-gatherers, nomadic groups, such as the Nummic peoples, the Shoshone, Paiute, Ute, Kwaisu, Chemehuevi, the list goes on. These folks are largely excluded from the agriculture discourse because it's easier to fit them into a model of hunter-gatherer societies. However, sources going back to the 1890s, such as Frederick Coville, indicate that Shoshone Native Americans in Death Valley and in Owens Valley were growing farm plots. So here we have these historic records in the late 19th century describing farm plots. Now, the plants grown were a mixture of native plants to the area, but there were also some New World, or some rather Old World domesticates, such as watermelons. So this raises the question, did the farming start pre or post-contact? We get some clues from the northern end of the Death Valley area, where there seems to be evidence of the usage of playa fissures to cultivate crops, because these form natural water channels in the lowest point where water gathers the latest in the season in these very dry areas. Other evidence from the middle 19th century indicates that Paiute of Owens Valley did farm plots largely along the foot of the eastern Sierra Nevadas. So I return to why do we think, or why is the general consensus that these semi-nomadic peoples in eastern California didn't have agriculture? Well, there was significant population decline from violence and disease in the latter half of the 19th century. And as a sort of social more, there was an overall taboo on farming the plots of the recently deceased. This taboo might last for a year or two. So as more and more people died, more and more land went fallow and then went overlooked by Euro-American settlers. So this raises the question of what counts as agriculture. If you took out the Old World domesticates from the Mojave Desert example, then the plants being grown would look like simply the wild natural plants, only they were being intentionally planted and irrigated. However, this doesn't show up very well in the archaeological record, raising certain levels of controversy. So again, I ask the question, what counts as agriculture? Well, obviously, the Three Sisters crops, right? Maize, beans, squash. We see that through about roughly 2/3 of the United States prior to contact. But there are also domesticates from North America. And especially if we look at the plains and what we would consider the eastern woodlands, so along the Mississippi drainage, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, we see marsh elder, chenopod's, for example, squashes like pumpkins, and sunflowers. Now there are other cultivated crops, like cereal grains and wild rice. And on that notion of wild, I refer back to the case study from Owens Valley and Death Valley, where a lot of these otherwise wild crops, ones that don't show signs of domestication, have in fact become invisible in the archaeological record. Now, there are other plant foods that are neither irrigated nor clearly cultivated. Seeds and nuts, such as folks in California would have subsisted off of in the western half of California, acorns, and in the eastern half and throughout the Great Basin, pinyon nuts. Interestingly, it is worth noting that the pinyon pine, on which so many Native American groups relied on for their subsistence, originates in the mountain range that separates what is now Death Valley National Park from Owens Valley in the Inyo White Range. Artifacts associated with the Namak peoples, such as the Shoshone, are seen spreading into the Great Basin around the time that the pine nuts are. And in fact, specifically, I'm talking about the spread of incised slate tablets, or Shoshone charmstones, as David Hurst Thomas would call them. But we should also consider the cultivation of non-food plants, fibers such as cotton, yucca, willow, and even cactuses from which these spines could be used for weaving and sewing. And then other plants might have been gardened not for the plant itself to be harvested, but for something else to be harvested on it, such as is the case for prickly pear. We have evidence at Mesa Verde that the dye cochineal, a very prized dye, sort of a bluish purplish color, comes from a beetle, or rather the leavings of a beetle that prefers to hang out on prickly pears. And in fact, we see an association between rock art and gardening. And so I want to leave you now, after this discussion, with a little bit of a blooper reel. Enjoy. So this beautiful take 9. Ugh. Okay, so, well, first of all, let's see if we've got the mic balanced a little bit better here. I've turned down the gain an extra amount here. And at this point now, I'll be taking your questions on the air if you have any questions. So, yeah. Do you have any questions about what kinds of crops were raised, what kinds of technologies were used, who farmed, who didn't? Yeah, and thank you. Yeah. Otherwise, we could just sit here and like admire my hat, right? Truly an archaeologist hat. Cool, thank you. All right, we finally tuned the mic in. I guess one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize in this video is that agriculture is something that we have tried to address in archaeology for a long time, but the further along that we seem to advance, the more that we feel like we're honing in the picture, the more that it starts to fall apart sometimes. And that's the case with these crops that are archaeologically invisible. These the cultivation of native plants that not necessarily planted in rows. Planting in rows is very much an introduced Euro-American thing. So we could have had irrigated fields, intentionally planted, intentionally harvested, that just are invisible. Well, at MPPP, we do not specifically farm or garden. However, I think all of the employees here do. I certainly do. Saw the clips from my garden. And, sort of on that topic, this year, well, right now, I'm just beginning to plant. The traditional marker for this area, there are certain peaks around, mountain peaks, that have snow on them. And when the snow melts is the time that you traditionally plant. This is getting a little iffy because as climate change continues, the time of the last frost and the time that the snow melts away is kind of shifting. Right now there are still some spots on the traditional peak for the area where I live. This would be called Truchas Peak, but there's not very much. Yes. Yeah. We document a number of agricultural features on the mesa, and this is one of the reasons why we don't actually farm the mesa or garden the mesa itself. One would be we don't really have enough labor available to do that. But two, it would risk disturbing the archaeological evidence, and we don't want to contaminate a study of farming practices that have occurred on the mesa by introducing something new at the moment. Waffle gardens. As far as I know, that's a Zuni thing. But we do have grid gardens. So not too dissimilar from what you see at Zuni. And grid gardens here, like at Zuni, are often seen sort of at the bottom of stormwater diversion, for example. Yeah, let's see here. How many have been found on the mesa? That's a good question. Um, I don't necessarily think that I have a number right on hand right now, uh, but that's definitely worth looking into. They're not expressly rare, but sort of to roundabout answer the question without actually giving any numbers. We tend to do survey and recording in 20-acre blocks. Now, any given 20-acre block may or may not have some kind of obvious garden plot. However, some of them have multiple. So I'd say probably a little under one per 20 acres, just as an estimate. Um, and we're working on, oh, right now, 6 to 8,000 acres. So I could say there are an estimated, there could be as many as 400 plots in areas that we have recorded and that we haven't yet recorded. All right, next question. Acequias. Yeah, yes and no. The acequias don't actually go onto the mesa itself, but running along the foot of the mesa is the Rio Grande River, and there is an acequia along along the margins of the river in the area that we sometimes refer to as the bosque. So, and it does run pretty close to the foot of the mesa. Um, we consider them to be a part of the heritage of farming at Mesa Prieta, especially since they were utilized by the communities that left rock art here, both native and settler colonial. But yeah, they're not actually on the slopes of the mesa. Yeah. Uh, let's see here. Turner would be the reference there. Turner 2011 for. So the question was: are there references for? Um, are there references for archaeoastronomical alignments? And I seem to have overlooked adding Turner into the references list here. Um, but yeah, that would be the reference. Let's see if I could. Maybe I can pull it up very quickly here. Probably not. Okay. Wait. Nope. Okay. Let's see here. Next question. Any more questions? All right. Any more questions? Well, if we're still waiting on questions here, I'm going to see if I can pull up Turner very quickly. here we go. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Um, so here, do any of the petroglyphs on the mesa reflect farming or gardening crop depictions? We have some images that appear to be plants. Whether or not those plants are actually the farmed plants, like corn, is a matter of interpretation. But also, we see an association between petroglyph panels and some of these garden plots, especially gridded gardens. So, one of the things that we might see or that we expect might have been grown at gridded gardens, in addition to corn, would be cotton. Some of the work that is currently in progress and that we haven't yet quite published on, but we suspect that there are we suspect that there are several archaeoastronomical observations at Mesa Prieta, and some of those do seem to be associated with some of these potential farming plots. So that's one of the areas of active investigation. Yeah. Paula, the acequia that runs through Leiden, that is, it may not be exactly the original ditch dug in the late 1590s, but it is, whether or not it is the original or simply the replacement for it, that is certainly one that can be tied to that sort of melding of native agricultural practices and the Spanish concept of acequias, beginning in 1598 with the arrival of Oñate. Mary asks, what other wild plants were used by Pueblo people? Good question. Pueblo people also gathered pine nuts, but didn't seem to necessarily cultivate them. We often think of the domesticates of corn, but there are, now I don't want to get some of these wrong, but some of the common plants around had not only culinary use but also more practical use. And I think the common name is rabbit ears, sometimes referred to as lamb's ears. It's sort of a fuzzy plant that had will flower with a very tall stalk. That one definitely had use, and there was also use of other things like tree bark. I should emphasize that willow. We've got a lot of red willow growing along the waterways. Again, not culinary, but certainly a plant that was used. All right, and to circle back to the archaeoastronomy question, Christopher Turner wrote several articles on archaeoastronomy and its uses by the Hopewell, with the relevance to agriculture being that some of these alignments are specifically focused on catching the sunlight just right at either sunrise or sunset for the planting season. All right. But yeah, we do seem to see this stuff reflected in the rock art. We have some signs of plant imagery, but more often we might think of the rock art as functioning in cooperation with the fields. So it may not necessarily depict the crops, but it may mark a place where a particular garden plot was. It may have even been a calendric marker and done something with light and shadow, or with an alignment with particular parts of the sky, or depictions of particular seasonal constellations, all of which might have been very useful information to have to planting crops and harvesting. So we've got a lot of examples out there that we would still love to do more research on. All right. Did I answer all the question? Oh, I overlooked a question by Paula about how many gravel, mulch, and or grid gardens have been found on the. Oh no, I think I might have gotten to that one. Um, but yeah, good point about a whole lot of them along the Rio Chama and uh, the Rio del Oso, or the Rio Ojo Caliente. Uh, One of the books that I would recommend for that, if you can find it, reframing the Northern Rio Grande Pueblo Economy by Scott Ortman. A few of the chapters in here directly address those farming practices along the Chama and its tributaries. Another one of the sources that I used to produce this video is Ancient North America by Brian Fagan. Some of its information is a little bit out of date. It was written in the 90s, but still very useful and can really help you get these broader scale ideas. So, yeah, and I do think that I remembered to add Fagan here. Yeah. Glad you're enjoying it, Ken. Um, yeah. Okay. So, unless there's more questions, I think that's about that all. That's about all that I wanted to cover. And yeah. So I want to wish everyone. Looks like we got it all. I want to wish everyone a good weekend. Again, stay safe out there. Take your proper precautions. And I'm looking forward to the next coming chats. We still haven't really landed on all of the topics for the next few months, but next month, because of the upcoming solstice, I'm going to be covering archaeoastronomy. Some of it, some good examples of it, some questionable examples, and why this can be a tough topic to address in archaeology. And yet, it's a very popular one, too. So, yeah, look forward to that one coming next month. Also next month, I'm going to be talking for the MPPP lecture series about conserving sonic heritage, which is, in layman's terms, about sonic heritage being the sound of an archaeological landscape. And how do we balance that with development and visitation? So, yeah, thank you all for tuning in, for your questions and your comments. Oh, yes, also, we'll have, at the end of this month, we have Arthur Cruz of Okeowinge, also known as San Juan Pueblo, who will be talking about Fioge Pueblo. So definitely tune in for that as well. All right, I've enjoyed the stream. I've enjoyed your comments. And again, have a good weekend.